Hi, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Can I see a raise of hands for those of you who were here last year at the conference? Oh, great. Good. So I'm really excited to be presenting a bit of an update on the City of Sarasota's climate adaptation planning because we kind of kicked it off last year. And so when I presented on it, it was just getting started, and we're really excited to be at the final stage now, and I can actually talk about some of our results. So I'll briefly go over, because I only have 10 minutes, so we'll not be able to get into any details for sure, but I'll briefly go over again why we're doing it, the steps we're taking, and then some of the results and where we're at right now. So as a little background, why we're doing it because our city commission told me to do it, for sure. That's one of the main reasons. But because we provide really critical, important public services, of course. We do our wastewater treatment, we work on roads, we work on our water supply, and all of the equipment that goes with providing these public services. So taking climate projections into account in our large capital investments and our large policy decisions is really a responsible thing to do. And so we want to make sure that we're taking some of this science into account when we're making our big investment decisions. We also wanted, one of the purpose and goals of the plan was to make staff more comfortable talking about climate science. We have an interdepartmental team now that is kind of been working together over the last year and a half, and we really have seen a lot more conversation on how we can better integrate and talk about climate science within city projects and policies. And also, we wanted a really organized way to prioritize projects for funding. The way that this process worked is that we have a menu of ideas for adaptation now for our prioritized vulnerabilities within the city, and now we have kind of a process that we've gone to prioritize things and try to research and get funding at this point. So I want to be clear what the scope of the study was that we did through this process. And resiliency takes so many, to be truly resilient, you have to look at a lot of different aspects, including how climate impacts impact neighborhood scale issues, public health, business districts, all these types of things. But what this study scoped, just for capacity and for other reasons, this study scope looked at government infrastructure. So we did look at the assets and infrastructure. We're talking pipes and roads and lift stations and all that kind of hard infrastructure, and some of our natural systems, which I'll show you. But that's the scope. So this green box up here is what we really focused on within this study. We went through 6 steps. We're at the step 6 right now, but we went through 6 steps from the very beginning. The very first step was to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, these are the climate projections we are going to use for the city of Sarasota's impacts. This is what we're going to consider in our planning process. And we presented that to our city commission, they adopted them, and that was the foundation of all the other steps. We then did a huge list of all the infrastructure and assets that we wanted to overlay those projections onto. So we did a big list, and I'll show a little bit about what those are later. And then we did a vulnerability assessment to understand where we were vulnerable to future climate projections, and then we prioritized them. Once we had our priorities, that went into the next step of actually identifying some possible solutions and adaptation strategies, and all that bundled together is in step 6 of the plan, which is available now, and that we'll be taking to our city commission on Monday. This is just a quick timeline. We started the planning process formally back in September of 2016. We were really fortunate to have the guidance of a consultant team that helped us go through this, HDR, and I see Chris Sherrick from the project team is here, Sherry Swanson, our project manager. So they definitely are local and helped us go through this process. We also had a lot of help from that interdepartmental kind of staff team of our wastewater engineers, our stormwater engineers, our transportation engineers at the city, our city planners. We had a big team that kind of walked through this together. And I'll quickly go over the steps, but essentially step 1 was identifying those local climate projections that we were going to use and to communicate on. We did decide to go with the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's projections. They updated, of course, in the middle of our planning process in for 2017 projections. And fortunately, we were able to kind of switch gears a little bit and use the 2017 projections. That in a very simple explanation, is about 12 to 18 inches of projected sea level rise for our area compared to current day levels. And I want to just mention it's technically 1.04 feet to 1.44 feet. So that 12 to 18 inches is an easy way to explain it. Storm surge, we looked at in considering sea level rise on top of current day storm surge, and what the projections showed us that in 2050, Category 1 storm surge will look like today's Category 2 when you consider sea level rise in addition to it. We also looked at extreme rainfall and this was one of our biggest challenges with modeling and with understanding what projections to consider, but due to seasonal interannual variability and some local tidal gauges not showing clear trends. But with the National Climate Assessment and the Southeast United States, we did see projections for a 5 to 10% increase in those extreme rainfall events, which have a huge impact on our stormwater system, of course. So we took that into account, and the extreme heats. We've seen locally a 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit increase since 1965, just based on our current, our temperature gauges locally. We've also seen a little over 7 inches of sea level rise since 1947, based on our closest tidal gauge locally. So that's from 1947 till today. So we have seen some historical impacts, and we're also looking at future projections here. So step 2, that next step that we did is we identified all the assets we wanted to look at in infrastructure. We looked at stormwater, transportation, water supply, wastewater, public lands and shorelines, such as our parks and recreation areas, critical buildings for emergency operations, and water features, we just mean some of our tidal creeks and bayous. We did the vulnerability assessment, which has a whole methodology that I could totally nerd out to everybody and tell you about, but it essentially, I don't have time for it, unfortunately. We have the sensitivity and adaptive capacity was our risk, and then we looked at the vulnerability by calculating and putting actual values to the likelihood each asset was going to be impacted and the consequence shall it be impacted. And the consequence was really interesting, a little more subjective, but a really good exercise for a team to go through and say, what's the economic impact to our city if this intersection is flooded? What's the environmental impact? What's the cultural, historical impact? And what's the public safety and health impact? And each one of those got a ranking of 1 to 5, and we have data for days based on the 220 assets that we looked at. We then prioritized those, and essentially each of those 220 infrastructure points that we looked at in the transportation, water, wastewater, stormwater, all those sectors, we graphed them. And if they were both highly vulnerable and highly at risk, they were a priority, and those are ones that we said, hey, we need to do something about these. I unfortunately can't go through all the results of every sector, but we did look total at 34 transportation assets, including bridges and roads and all that. 15 were shown as being vulnerable. Here's a list of them here. Probably not a surprise to a lot of locals. Some may be more of a surprise than others. There's more details in the report, but you'll see Fruitville here, Fruitville and 41, Main Street, because the consequence of the economic impacts was so high. The 10th Street boat ramp is our only official emergency operations, so there's different reasons why these made them up here, but we have now prioritized vulnerabilities that are all graphed and have methodology. Stormwater might not be a surprise, but that was our most vulnerable sector here that we had results that showed up as we looked even to the detail of tidal outfalls out to the bay and how high they were above the tide, and we looked really detailed at this. Public lands, we looked at in a different light because parks are so important, not only if they're vulnerable, but the value they can provide in the future for stormwater retention and other issues. The very last step was identifying adaptation strategies. And this is just an example. We have this for all of our priority ones where we have a menu of list of ideas for each of those vulnerabilities that have been identified. And this is a great starting point to now say, okay, when there's a roundabout being designed, for example, with the Florida Department of Transportation, how can we integrate some of our adaptation solutions that 30 seconds, oh my gosh, that we've identified. And so, all of this is in the report. You can see, for example, some of our city well stations, some of the adaptation options we've identified is to we got as detailed as looking at actually relocating them to certain areas and hardening electrical components. I mean, it's a really detailed thing here. So at the end of the report, we have recommendations that were taken to City Commission on Monday evening, where we'll talk a little bit about funding and next steps and accountability for how we're going to implement this, how we'll want to implement it into our capital improvement process, look at establishing funds to acquire public lands. And it goes on and on. I also want to mention one of the recommendations is to develop a regional climate council that's really happening right now with a new initiative called the Climate Council of Southwest, of Sarasota Manatee, that's getting some momentum to really work across sectors, and I'm excited to see that move forward. And essentially the plan is at that website up there. We're going on Monday, and it's had public input throughout. We had a big workshop in August and had different input points. We hope to have it finalized in January, and I just hope that this shows one example of how we're trying to look at climate science and apply it locally for adaptation considerations. So sorry I didn't have more time, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you.
Son?